but I'll begin in just a minute, just to make sure we have everybody in here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. We are just before 10:30 a.m. Central Time, and I want to say welcome to the Minnesota M365 Fall Admin Workshop. My name is Doug Wilson. I'm helping moderate this session today, and I'm on the board of the user group, so I definitely appreciate everybody being here. I'm really excited to have Joanne here presenting on the principles of retention in Microsoft 365 and what to know before you start. These sessions are always really interesting and definitely excited for it. As always, as a user group, we always ask to help drive awareness to our events, our Twitter at O365MN or the tag pound M365 Workshop Day. Just a few notes before I hand it over to Joanne. For our announcements, we do record these meetings just to make sure if anybody wants to review them or go back and make sure they heard everything, or because it's so amazing that we want to share them out. And then I ask that you mute yourselves if you're not talking, or if you haven't been asked to talk. If you do have questions, keep it for an appropriate time or when the speaker asks or presents a time for that, or please put them in chat. I will help moderate that chat. And then we do have live captioning available. And towards the end of the session, I will be reviewing participants and picking a random participant for a $25 gift card. And at the end of our session, at the end of our user group today, we'll ask that you go through our overall survey, and if you fill that out, you'll be entered for the grand prize of the Surface Go 3. I do really wish I could put one in because they are awesome devices. And one other thing I actually wanted to do, just call out thanks to all of our sponsors today. These organizations really do help make our user group and these events possible. So thanks to everybody here. And then Joanne, I will hand that over to you.
All right. Give me 20 seconds to get my life in order on this end.
Of course.
I'm going to do my best to kind of watch the chat as I'm talking, in addition to Doug, so I'll keep this train moving down the track. Okay, I'm assuming you can see my slide and we're all sitting in the right session. It's a pleasure to be here today, by the way. I really am fond of the Minnesota user group. I've gone to the SharePoint Saturday back in the day a few times, so thrilled to be here today speaking with you. Doug went through most of this stuff, so hashtag this session if you feel so inclined. I would appreciate that. I want to give a personal thanks to the sponsors. I know it's an effort for them and you know, money they're putting towards this, so thank you very much to them. I am Joanne Klein, and I am from Saskatchewan in Western Canada, and my focus in the Microsoft world is in compliance, which is a really big area. Today, I'm talking, of course, about retention, information governance, those principles of retention, and that whole ball of wax, if you will. So traditionally, compliance isn't too exciting, but I really quite enjoy this space. It's a challenge. Just a literal ton of stuff to know once you get into this space, which probably many of you sitting in this session have long since realized this. The reason I'm standing in front of you today and where a lot of my commentary comes from is working in this space for quite a while. My focus in on the compliance area isn't on these features. So I extend beyond records management and information governance. Compliance covers a plethora of things, but today's conversation, I'm going to hone in on that. I have a very strong SharePoint background, which has helped me in this compliance role because lots of touch points between SharePoint and the compliance features. I have worked with a lot of clients. I was recently a consultant with Microsoft and also got an opportunity while I was there to work with many really large customers and got some valuable lessons from that. So I will share what I can with you through today, and hopefully you have some good things to take away. My general approach to compliance sounds trivial and almost super simple, but the crawl, walk, run, which Microsoft also talks about, is a proven, established approach I've seen used by small organizations right up to really large ones. This is a complicated space. And if you try to figure everything out before you start, you will be paralyzed by all of the decisions you have to make. So that's why this just makes sense. So we're in this for the long haul. Of course, your compliance teams are going to have to understand what are those obligations that they have to meet, either regulatory, legal, or just business obligations for the content across your environment. There's always a decision that you have to make. Cost benefit analysis, pretty important. Licensing is one consideration. So if you don't have a license to do something, what is that costing you in other ways? And building in compliance from the start is really where records managers are going to nowadays, rather than being a strictly risk mitigation role, kind of brought in after the fact. They're trying to get involved right at the start of when some of these new business processes are being digitized, new solutions are being built. We really want them involved right at the beginning. So this is what I'm covering. The principles of retention are in the last bucket, but I wouldn't be doing the topic justice if we didn't talk about those principles. Aren't really going to make much sense unless you have a pretty strong foundational knowledge of information governance and records management all up across the service. So that's what I'm calling, you must know this before you worry even about the principles of retention. So we'll cover a lot of ground today. So on the compliance side, the reason this is so complicated and that it's not an optional thing anymore, if you once thought it was or your organization thought it was, is regulators and customers really expect more on how you're handling their data. And these regulations are changing a lot. It's challenging for compliance teams to stay ahead of this. And the technology double-edged sword. So when you think about retention and governance, it's considerably simpler if you just focus in on maybe an Exchange mailbox or a SharePoint site. But if you start bringing in all of these other modern tools that we're working with today, the one we're using right now, and there's chats going on the right-hand side, what if you have to have a retention control on that? How on earth do you deal with that? So this is a major contributing factor to why the complexity of this space has just been elevated exponentially over the past few years. And organizations, from what I've observed, are really wanting and needing to modernize their approach. So it's really not an optional exercise, and status quo can be an expensive place to be. So automation is your friend. That means more licensing within the Microsoft 365 world, but in my humble opinion, there's simply no other way to get ahead of this. Unless you're a small to medium-sized business and you have pretty good and tight control over your environment, Possibly you could do it without, you know, leveraging much automation, but for most organizations that I've worked with and I've seen, they're going to have to lean in order to do this at scale. And end users are being asked to maybe be a little bit more compliance savvy than they once used to be. It's just a reality of life nowadays. So we want them to be our ally. Automate as much as we can, yes, but they're still going to be asked to make some decisions in the moment that are going to affect the security and compliance of a piece of content. Okay. So the interesting dynamic I see in many of my customer engagements are between these roles, compliance and IT. And sometimes it's one or the other team that has come to me and asking for some consulting guidance, which is kind of interesting. But on both sides of the house, it's increasingly interdisciplinary, particularly in the modern workplace and in the cloud. And you can see the range of roles that would be considered, you know, compliance professionals. This extends way beyond records managers and information managers, and the traditional or legacy focus that these roles have been on. Now, neither is an expert on the other side. So I don't know the roles of who's in attendance today. I'm assuming most of you are on the IT side, and you're probably not in your head. You're not compliance experts, and yet you're going to likely be asked to implement some of these features in the back end. So it is imperative that we kind of form a partnership that perhaps wasn't really there or strong before between these two groups. So working together, here's some ideas I have of how this relationship can be strengthened. The compliance roles certainly need to understand to a base level anyway, how the tech work, how Microsoft has implemented the tech behind the scenes in order to meet their goals. IT, you really need to understand how the underlying tech works, which I know everyone is trying to figure out, and you know is maybe at varying levels of that journey right now. The RBAC model for permission roles will allow some organizations to take advantage of this and give the compliance professionals access to do things in the compliance center, which is a good model, rather than IT administrators doing it, right? There's lots of reasons for this: compliance and security and privacy, many reasons why you would want to do this, to have compliance roles self-serve. And leveraging automation, and that comes in many flavors. I'm going to talk about some of them later, in order to be able to do this at scale. So if you invite a compliance team into a project where you're digitizing some formerly legacy process, could be paper, could be just, you know, still digital, but, you know, old and legacy, make sure you're bringing them in from the get-go. And then IT, you understanding the controls, you might be able to determine, well, how can we help automate this whole process, including a retention label and maybe even a sensitivity label on a piece of content. This all goes back to doing it like that. It's privacy by design and compliance by design. It's not an afterthought. It's built right into how are we going to approach this. So how Microsoft approaches compliance, this is their go-to market pillars that organize the features in the back end of the compliance center. And as you can see, there is a lot of features back there. So today we're honing in on information governance and records management. But to be clear, there is touch points with all of these features in the back end, which is why this is such a wide and interdisciplinary space to be in. So typically, IT admins maybe you slice and dice your roles as well and focus in on different areas in the back end. This is a good representation of compliance stakeholders. You know, depends on the size of the organization, you know, of the roles that you have defined kind of at that executive level. But by and large, these are the groups and the go-to-market pillar that they align with as far as the features. So today, we're talking about these two groups, the records managers and the IT admin security people that are going to be working in the compliance center configuring some of these controls. All right, so what I've observed through the number of customers that I've worked with so far is there are some things that I like to have a discussion with, common, I guess, I won't call them problems, but things that kind of catch a records manager when we're starting an engagement. So I like to kind of get in front of these. Common lexicon is terminology to align on, and I've got two here. I plan on adding to this whenever I hear a new one. And one is typically in a retention schedule. It will be a retention label will be referred to as a record type or a record series. In Microsoft speak, that translates into what they call a retention label. I'm bringing these up because if you're working with records managers, you might hear them using different terms, and it can be confusing. Words are very important, particularly in the technology world, so I just want to point this out. Another one is records managers, particularly in regulated industries, will call pretty much all of the content, a few exceptions maybe, but a business record. In Microsoft's implementation of a record, it's a special attribute on a retention label to mark something as a record. So I've gone down rabbit hole conversations with records managers where I'm calling something a record, they're calling something a record, and we're kind of talking about two different things. So I just wanted to point this out. Here's another one, particularly if you are in a large tenant, worked with some very large customers where within one tenant, there are kind of multiple organizations, if you will, or agencies. But records management, by and large, at least the way it's been architected and works today, is a tenant level construct. And this is what I mean by that. Although when you assign the permission to a records manager, they have access to all of the records management features in the back end. There is one file plan per tenant. So let's say you had 20 different sub-organizations or departments, and you wanted to have a record manager for each one of those. When they went in, they would only see their records. That is not the way, or their retention labels, that is not the way this works. So all retention label definitions are visible to everybody. Although you can set some attributes on a retention label like department, a category and a subcategory, and filter, group and sort on that, you can't permission trim based on that. Maybe a small point, but large organizations often ask for this, and I just wanted to make sure they know this is not how it works. All right, mapping a retention schedule. So they will be very familiar with the retention schedule they have, and this likely covers records outside of Microsoft 365 as well. So many of them look to how can I automate this schedule I currently have in the format that it's in into a file plan inside Microsoft. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. All right, so there is a prescribed format that the file plan in Microsoft 365 needs to take. And you can see from left to right, it's defining the labels, the descriptions, the retention action, whether it declares the piece of content that label is applied to a record, so on and so forth. So I will link to the link in docs.microsoft.com that explains the allowed values in each one of these columns. But records managers need to get their retention schedule in this format, and then they can upload it into the file plan as a CSV, and their labels are automatically added. So I'm going to what that looks like. So sorry, I'm using a clicker and it's just not quite working for me. Okay, so you can see here I've uploaded that particular spreadsheet in this tenant. It's imported 12 labels. I've also defined my business functions and departments within that spreadsheet, so and some categories. So it's brought in that as well, and the authority types. So once I do that, this is a records management feature, additional licensing or advanced licensing. You can see I'm in the file plan on the top tab, and it's imported all of these labels. When you import them, they are by default in an inactive state. It's just putting the definition in here. They haven't been included in a policy, so no end users are seeing these yet. They're not being auto-applied anymore, anywhere. It's just the definition of the labels. But super helpful, particularly in large organizations where they have, it doesn't have to be a large organization, in large file plans, I should say. Okay, the last one I want to talk about is, it's definitely a challenge for records managers, and for sure a challenge for IT trying to implement these, is what I call challenging language in retention schedules. And here's some examples, and some of these can be exceedingly difficult to implement in a technical way, because you need to have some kind of control or business process around the content in some cases in order to, if we look at number 3, 1 year unless needed for tax purposes. Well, what drives if you need it for tax purposes? Is that a manual decision that an end user is making? Is there a status that you're going to build into that content? There needs to be something driving that process. Or are you going to set it out 1 year and then leave it up to the disposition reviewer to decide if it's needed for tax purposes and then keeping it longer? So lots of little decisions you need to make, and sometimes file plans are full of scenarios like this, and this is why it takes a while to map the retention schedule into an actual implementation inside Microsoft. All right, so on the IT admin side, your understanding needs to be quite deep and technical on these things. You can see principles of retention are the second one from the bottom. That's by design. Don't jump ahead to that unless you have an authoritative understanding of the 5 things before it. Else you will probably get down a rabbit hole and be maybe a little bit confused on how things are going to work. So this is just my experience. Your mileage may vary, but if you're just getting into this space, this is a very good kind of path to test your knowledge on how all of these features work together. And these, by the way, are my essentials. This is not endorsed by Microsoft. This is just based from my experience in the field. So retention policies and retention labels at a high level can take one of 3 actions. They can just retain only, so there's no deletion component at all. I don't see that option used that much. Retain and delete, which is the most common. So retain contracts for 2 years after the contract expires. Retain budget documents for 3 years after the fiscal year end, etc. Or they can actually have no retention component at all and just delete. It's still called a retention policy, but all it has is a deletion component. So this example I have here, I see a ton of organizations implementing that. And they do this because they don't want business decisions made, resulting in a business record within a Teams chat. So to prevent that from happening, they communicate to the staff. This is a fairly short-lived, in this case, 30-day historical record of your Teams chats. We're going to automatically delete them at the end of 30 days. You can do it earlier if you want, because there's no retention component, but we're going to make sure it's gone after 30 days. So the reason I bring this up is when you're conversing with the records management team and you're coming up with the model for what you're about to implement, words are important. Make sure they have articulated if they want any kind of retention at all, or if they're just concerned about deleting it after a certain period of time. That's why when someone says, I've got a retention policy published to this site, that's not enough for you to go on. You need to ask more probing questions. What is the action that's defined on that retention policy? That's why I say understanding the action is really the most important part of a retention policy and a retention label. There's some differences between these two, big and vast differences, really. And the policy, retention policy, is applied at a container or a location level, site, team, group, mailbox. Retention label is at a granular email or file level. For the most part, an end user is unaware that a retention policy is in effect on the location that they're working in. So if there's a retention policy published to their mailbox, there would be nothing in there indicating to them that it's there. Same on the SharePoint and OneDrive side. Retention label is something that an end user can interact with. So if you're familiar with how you update metadata or look at metadata inside SharePoint, retention label is just going to appear as a piece of metadata, just like everything else. Although you can't make it mandatory, there's a few things you can't do, currently anyway. Huge differentiator, and usually the first kind of decision, the question in the decision tree of which one is going to be right for whatever it is you're doing is, do you need a defensible disposition on this piece of content, or can you just outright remove it? If you can outright remove it, you can use either a policy or a label, but if you need that disposition review process, you have to go the retention label route. So this feeds back into the retention schedule and the file plan for sure. Different retention labels give different levels of, it's called immutability, on how much you can control the content of a document and the metadata that goes with it. On the label side, you have many more options available to you, not on the policy side. The retention policy just does strict retention. Different options on how you can configure them and the date, and they can be published to different locations. So here's all the locations on the retention policy side, here's on the retention label side. So the differences are here. So that example I gave before about deleting Teams chats after 30 days would be a retention policy published to Teams users, Teams chats set to delete after 30 days. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a site where a demo site where I have both of these in flight. Just in case you've never seen this before. So this is a demo site, and I've got a whole bunch of SharePoint sites I have set up to demonstrate a few things. So I'm demonstrating to you the retention policy on a SharePoint site. Similar but different mechanism goes on in an Exchange mailbox. It uses something called a recoverable items partition to keep the changes and deletions kind of hidden behind the where an end user can see it. On SharePoint OneDrive, it does it with a different mechanism, same process, but it uses the preservation hold library. So I'm on a SharePoint site. I have a retention policy published here. And I have some documents. So if I delete, let's say, sample policy 1, and the retention policy is to retain for 30 days or a year. I don't know what it is, but it's a retention policy that is not yet, has not yet been met. So if I try to delete this guy, it will absolutely let me delete it. So in that way, I have no indication as an end user that there's anything going on here. So if I go back to site contents, there is hidden to everybody but the site collection admin, including the site owners. The site owners would see this, that there's a preservation hold library back here. And the document I just deleted is right here, sample policy 1. So this is not a library that anyone would ever go into and find a document and restore it likely. Its purpose is for retention and compliance. It's not a backup. Its purpose is for regulatory purposes. So e-discovery can find it. You can search for it if you need to, if you are having an audit. That's the purpose of this library. The contents in this library, particularly if you have long retention periods, can get pretty big. So I just want to point out that the preservation whole library contributes to your overall SharePoint site storage quota. I'm just going to stop. I've got a question. Do you find that most companies go with this policy of deleting the chats after 30 days? We are new into Teams, and that is one area we see a benefit to retaining chats, but the business owners of retention don't like too much information being kept. Right, and there's the rub. So it depends on, I think, the regulations your organization is beholden to. If the compliance professionals in your organization have executive buy-in and they are the ultimate decision makers for how long those Teams chats are being held, they have typically the authority to say, no, we're going to delete them after 30 days. Compliance teams are always balancing the collaboration experience and the compliance obligations. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's whatever your organization can come to terms with, knowing that if you don't get rid of those chats, they're discoverable. There might be private information in there. It exposes you to other risks. So it's not an easy decision to make if you take into account all of the security and compliance impacts of that decision. That would be my guidance all up for most organizations. Okay, I'm just going to show you then. I'm going to go into just a regular SharePoint site. I've got some retention labels published here. As soon as you publish a retention label to a site, every library in that site sees all of the retention labels published to it. You can see here, I've got already some permanent retention labels assigned to some of these documents. So how you do it is you just select a document, this information pane opens, and apply label is a retention label, not a sensitivity label. And every label published directly to this site, I'm going to see in the drop down here. So I'll pick this guy. This is me manually applying a label to this document. This doesn't require an advanced compliance license in order to manually apply a label. Okay, I'll just leave that there and I'll come back to that in a minute. Different levels of immutability. I probably won't get into this, maybe for time. You can see there's a lock on the permanent record. If you declare a retention label to mark the item as a record, this is what happens. It puts a lock on it when that retention label is applied. Now, our document can be in a locked and an unlocked state. And when it's in a locked state, you will see the lock. When it's in an unlocked state, you can see this second document also has the permanent retention label, but there's no lock there. So if I were to select this guy and look over here, I can see the record status is unlocked. You're going to see record status when the retention label marks the item as a record. So the purpose of this record status is to allow end users to modify the content of the document. So if I tried to open up sample document 1, it wouldn't let me change the contents of it. But because I've unlocked this second record, I can open this guy up and I can change it if I wanted to. So you can tell here I was, yeah. Different kind of label. I should have picked a different example. I'm doing testing for this. Okay. So this is a change. By the way, you can't see the retention label when you're in here. You can see the sensitivity label, two different kinds of labels. And you can see it saved it. It saved the change. Oh, how do I? Oh, there. Okay, so it's changed it. Now let's say I want to lock this guy. Go down here. It's a toggle, so I'm going to say lock it. I'm done my changes. The lock is back on there. What has happened in the background is if I go back into the preservation hold library, record labels are treated a little bit different. It stores the different discrete versions of that document or the discrete records in a special folder inside the preservation hold library called records. This will automatically get created for you. And you can see here, probably, I don't know which one it was, but it stores the previous version in here as a record. Reason this is done, again, is for e-discovery requests and regulatory requests, audits, that kind of thing. So this is the mechanism behind the scenes that goes on when you're working with a record retention label. All right, so talked about this already, different kinds of labels as you move from left to right on this grid, so from a regular label all the way up to a regulatory record label, there's less and less things that end users can do with it. It layers a bigger degree of immutability on that piece of content. So Microsoft has documented this fairly well. I just wanted to point out there is significant differences between these labels, and even between an unlocked and a locked state of a record label, there is differences. So I've got a star beside delete the file. Right now, if you were to delete a file with a retention label, so not a record label, just a regular retention label, you would get that error message that's on the bottom right. So there is a change coming. It's not in my tenant yet, so rolling out right now, where you will be allowed to delete item with a regular retention label. It will be saved to the preservation hold library, because remember, it still needs to be retained. So, you know, presuming that the retention label still needs to be applied to that document, we need to ensure for compliance purposes that that document, that business record, is retained for the amount of time that we said it should be. So I think the idea behind this is it is supposed to not impede the collaboration experience as much as this right here is. All right. Somebody made a comment. They worked at a company that deleted chats after 7 days due to HIPAA compliance. Yes, so, yeah, that's true. I've also worked with companies that have deleted it after 1 day. Many companies complained that they, you know, didn't want their Teams chats to be deleted at all. So Microsoft put in the controls that they would stay forever unless you did a retention policy with the delete component, and then it would delete it earlier. Now some customers are coming saying they want them to be ephemeral, so they don't want them to be retained at all. So it really depends on the organization. It depends on how you treat Teams chats. As far as, you know, some organizations think it's a legal risk to retain them at all. So, you know, you get everything from soup to nuts on what is the right decision to make on that retention, particularly the Teams chats. All right, so applying a retention label, a ton of ways of doing this. And I showed you on that sample demo site how to do it manually. That doesn't require any kind of an advanced compliance license. But circled in red are all of the ways you can get a retention label on a piece of content. Depends on which location you're talking about on the availability of some of these, but by and large, it's SharePoint, OneDrive, and Exchange. Remember, you can't put, at least today anyways, you can't put a retention label on a Teams chat. It's only kind of a retention policy, location-based construct that goes there. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few of the ways of doing this other than pardon me, manually apply, just so you can understand the nuances and the difference that they have. Doesn't matter how you get that label on there. The definition of the label that's on the right-hand side is what controls, okay, how are we going to apply these controls to this particular piece of content? So whether it was auto-applied, defaulted, or manually set, the same rules still apply to it. Okay, so defaulting a library, it's pretty simple. It's in the library settings in the back end. And as a matter of fact, today anyway, even if you don't have an advanced compliance license, you're still going to see this option. So be careful. A really important thing to point out, I have talked to quite a few consultants and employees trying to implement this tech in the back end, that once a retention label has been applied to a piece of content, nothing will override it unless you manually, unless you remove a retention label and either change it or allow the auto apply to apply a different setting or allow a default to apply a different setting. So once it's on there, it is on there. Really important to know this, if you're building a solution in the back end that's, let's say, setting a retention label based on a status of something and wanting to do it using the auto apply functionality baked into Microsoft. So you can do that the first time, but when that status changes, the different policy won't run to change the retention label. That's a really important thing to understand because it sometimes changes the whole way you're approaching building the solution as far as getting a retention label on there. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, you can default it. So you can default it at either a folder or a document set, because document set, of course, inherits from a folder content type. So if you're familiar with SharePoint, this will kind of make sense for you. I see this model being used a lot on finance teams. So if you apply it at the folder level and you had content within there, within, I don't know, seconds, it's not that long, I don't think, all of the content within the folder inherits the same retention label. So that's pretty handy. Maybe you're dealing with, maybe you have a document set up for a contract and you just have to apply a contract retention label at the document set level and everything within it will inherit that retention label. Yeah, so I was saying, I see this a lot in finance, finance teams, very structured, very organized. They work in fiscal year folders or fiscal quarter folders, fiscal month folders. So having this process in place, and you can automate this as well, is super helpful. Okay, so you can auto apply based on a content type. Actually, I'm going to stop for a question. I'm going to read it here. Do you have any thoughts on applying a baseline retention label to all content to reduce data sprawl and never deleting data? Never ever? Then I wouldn't, if your purpose is to never delete any data, I wouldn't use a retention label. I would likely use a retention policy set to retain forever, but I've never seen an organization do that. I would guess I would pull the thread and ask, what is the concern about never deleting data? What is the business reason or the risk behind that ask? That's how I would approach it, and then just kind of the answer probably would fall out from that.
Sorry, let me clarify. I was more looking at if we should ever apply a default label to delete data after a certain period of time, like a specific time period.
Is there a disposition review that's required on that?
And that's a question, is we do have some standards around where we would prefer it to delete data on a regular cadence, and then anything labeled as a business record would ideally obviously be kept longer, but
I think having a good approach, one I've seen, but you need to have your people and processes in, ducks in a row, if you will, around this. Have a retention policy. Let's pick OneDrive, for instance. If you don't want to have the same kind of mess that people have in their personal drives on the shared network, put a retention policy published to everybody's OneDrive, but it has a deletion component. So it doesn't retain, it just makes sure it's deleted after you pick 3 years after last modified, 5 years, 7 years, whatever you're comfortable communicating to your staff. And then publish a set of retention labels to OneDrives and tell them, if you don't want your content to be deleted after 5 years, then apply these retention labels to those pieces of gold within there that you want to keep longer. That is a good model you can do. So it's combining both of them, but there are some hard decisions to be made and communicated to your staff in that regard. There's no right answer on that. But you know, that is an approach that I have seen, if that's helpful. Right, auto apply based on the content type. Here's an example of content types where you could use this model for sure. Simple condition, you can put in the auto apply retention label policy. Use case for this would be project documents. So all you do is put in this KQL condition in the label policy, and the documents, the unlabeled documents, will inherit this label. Okay, so the setup for this is I've got a project document content type. This is where your SharePoint provisioning process interacts with your compliance requirements. Because maybe you provision project sites, and part of that provisioning process you built creates this custom content type called project document, adds it to the library. Everything added to the library is a project document, and then this auto apply label policy running in the background will apply the correct retention label. So if this is the project retention label is set up, we just click auto apply. This functionality has not changed much over the last few years. So this is a fairly old demo, but it works exactly the same today, just so you know. So you can put that same query into content search and you're going to get the same results back, which is a good way of validating your query, by the way, because this takes up to 7 days before your retention label is going to be applied to your content. So that's a long time to wait if you're not sure you have your query right. So I would recommend testing it and validating it in content search. So up to 7 days. In this case, it was 4 days later. I've got an example of 2 different kinds of content types there, just to demonstrate that it's only applied the project retention label to the project document content type. You can auto apply based on the metadata value. Very similar to content type, but you can be a little bit more discreet about what label you're applying to what content. You can bring in dates here, which I see used a lot to kind of combine with the status. You know, if something is expired, so if it's past the expiry date, you maybe want to apply a sensitivity label or retention label, pardon me. So corporate policies is a good example of this. Maybe you want a retention policy applied when a corporate policy has been marked as obsolete or expired or superseded, and you can put this condition in there. You can combine conditions. That's where the power comes in on this. So a bit more setup on this. Some of these conditions require you to do a mapping to one of the refinable pre-configured managed properties in the back end of this SharePoint search schema. So if you're not yet familiar with how the SharePoint search schema works, it is worth your time to get in there and figure that out. That's why when I said earlier, because I have a strong SharePoint background, that helped me immensely when I came to doing the auto apply retention labels. So I would recommend kind of digging into that if you're not already familiar. So we have to add the piece of metadata to the library, get something called this managed property kind of set up so it understands the values that are in that column, and then create your retention label with your settings, and then we're going to auto apply it. Okay, so I'm going to put in the KQL. Again, you can, yeah, but I should have done the combined condition and that the content type was corporate policy, but I didn't in this case. But it does work, and you should verify that query in content search. So in this case, I've done some column formatting inside SharePoint to show which ones were expired and which ones weren't expired. Okay, so this is telling me these 3 yellow ones are expired, so it applied the corporate policy retention label. The ones below at the time of recording weren't yet expired, so it didn't apply those. So it's a good model, and it can be extrapolated to other use cases across your environment. Okay, a trainable classifier. There is a third option when you're doing an auto apply of a trainable classifier. I wanted to bring this up because I think it was at the recent Ignite, Microsoft announced a whole bunch of business trainable classifiers that they've released. They've done a heavy lifting on training these classifiers, and as you can see, they're all in preview mode, but they're mapping to common business content that organizations would have across their tenant. So I have yet to test this. That's on my very near to-do list. I want to see, because in my own tenant I have contracts. I'm going to try auto applying some label using this trainable classifier, and I want to see how accurate it is. So I think that's pretty cool. I want to make sure everybody knew about that. Another way, I'm not going to go into a deep dive on SharePoint Syntax, but if you are leveraging SharePoint Syntax at all in your environment, it's another way of getting a retention label and a sensitivity label actually on a piece of content. So how this works is SharePoint Syntax uses a couple different models. So I'm going to show here a document understanding model, and it does much more than just retention labels. It extracts sets of content type, it can extract metadata, but I'm focused in for the purposes of today's conversation on a retention label. So what you do is you define a document understanding model, you give it a name that translates to a content type, and lo and behold, down there you can set a predefined retention label you have set up in your environment on the piece of content if there's a match. So you publish a model to a library. So here, I've got the model published. I'm not going to go through that because it's not relevant for today's conversation, and I'm extracting some metadata and I'm setting a content type. So I publish it to one library. So one model can be published to a library. A library can have many models published to it. So I'm picking a site called The Works, the document library in that site. And when I do that, it's going to kind of wire up that document understanding model to that library. So we're going to go to that library. It's not going to have any content in it yet. You can see I've added all of the custom metadata I've extracted, and the last column is retention label because I want you to show, I want to show you rather, that the retention label will be set. So how this works is it identifies positive examples of, in this case, an SOW. So I'm uploading some quotes that aren't an SOW and some SOWs. So it takes a moment. You can see right now the default content type is document. It's going to flip that to SOW because that's what the document understanding model is defined for. And in this case, it set the retention label as well. So all kinds of places you can do this. All right, I want to talk about scoping. This is a very new kind of change on how we, the locations in which we can publish retention policies and label policies too. Up to this point in time, we haven't actually been using the term status scope. We've just been using the term scope. You publish a retention policy or a retention label to locations. We're now, let's call that a status scope now, and the reason is because we have a different kind of scope that gives us more flexibility. So up till now, you could publish your labels everywhere, or select locations, it was up to you to list them, or excluding locations, it was up to you to list them. So you don't have to think too long on two problems with that. One is there are limits to the number of inclusions and exclusions that Microsoft has documented clearly, and once you hit that limit, you just have to create another retention policy or label policy to continue on your inclusions or exclusions. So certainly possible. There's just some more maintenance that would likely be on IT admins to keep track of, okay, where are we at in this limit, and what locations need to be in what policies. And depending on the requirement retention ask, this can be a little bit of a bear to deal with. Currently in public preview is a new kind of way to scope your locations called adaptive scope. So it's dynamic in nature, and there's 3 different flavors of it: user-based, Microsoft 365 group-based, or SharePoint site-based. And they use different properties in order to dynamically determine what locations are included inside of the scope. So once you define your scope, it on its own doesn't do anything. It needs to be consumed and used inside either a retention policy or a label policy to dynamically define the locations. And then the retention mechanisms kick off after that. Use case for a user adaptive scope, and I hear this one quite often, is you've got different retention requirements for executives than for everybody else in your organization. So you would do an adaptive scope for the executive side and a static scope for everybody else. The reason this works together is the principles of retention, which we're going to talk about at the end of this on, any one particular location can have multiple policies and or labels published to it. And if that's the case, how on earth do you determine for any given email or any given file how long it needs to be retained for? So that's where a scenario like this presents itself to you, and you would have to know the principles of retention to know definitively executive emails, even though they're also included in the bottom one, they will be retained for 10 years because retention, the longest retention period wins. I can tell that by looking at this. No, that's not true. Retention wins over deletion. The second one would be just a deletion policy. Okay, so user adaptive scope is, you can use a whole bunch of Azure AD attributes. So in this example, I'm looking at Azure AD here, just a silly example, but I've got 2 people at my executive level, CEO and CFO, I want included in a policy. So this harkens back to how clean is your Azure Active Directory. Sometimes there's another project that spins off, and most organizations I work with have a perpetual project on cleaning up their Azure AD environment or their AD environment in general. But yet another example where you need to have some pretty tight, rigorous processes around maintaining a good AD structure in order to leverage it in this capability. So step 2 is using a query. I'm going to use this same type of query inside my adaptive scope definition. So I'm just querying my Active Directory to looking for CEO or CFO as a job title to make sure I only get those 2 back. You want to be 100% confident you've got your query right, because as soon as you use this adaptive scope in a policy, potentially there's going to be labels applied, there's going to be retention mechanisms going on these locations. So it's important you get these right. So we're going to create an adaptive scope. You're going to see, if you have this preview feature, a new tab inside records management for adaptive scopes. Name it. Here's the 3 types I talked about. So this is a user scope. And you can do it through the GUI, which is what I'm showing here. But if you had a more advanced query, and you can get very specific here, you can include users, exclude some users, get fairly advanced. You can use the advanced query builder and just paste in it's an OPath query into there. Okay, so once you do that, you gotta wait and save your adaptive scope. You have to wait up to a day before the locations that match your criteria are included inside the scope. So I waited up to a day, and you can see Susan Smith and I are now included in this adaptive scope. You create your retention label like you always did, nothing has changed there. The change happens when I publish this retention label. So in this case, I'm going to publish it with a condition. So this example, I want everything in the users that are in this adaptive scope, all of their emails and all of their files to have a retention label. So this is a condition I came up with. I tried just size greater than 0 on its own, thinking that would auto apply on the SharePoint content, but it didn't work for me. So this is what I came up with, but your mileage may vary. You may have a different way of identifying all of the content, you know, the files and the emails that you want to capture. So the condition is the same. Where you veer off to the right is now instead of a static scope. So we don't want to put in all of the executives' email addresses. I don't want to remember that it's Joanne and Susan, and then we hire a CTO and we got to put in Bob's email address. We don't want anyone to have to do that. So we're going to pick adaptive, pick executive employees, which is my adaptive scope name. And on the bottom, we want it to apply to their Exchange email and their OneDrive accounts. And we want to apply the executive label. So I waited a couple days, and then I'm looking in here in Susan's mailbox. And you can see here, I pick all of her messages, and their label executive has been applied to her mailbox. If I go to her OneDrive and select just a random file in there, you can see executive has been applied to her files inside of her OneDrive. Okay, on the SharePoint side, a great use case for this, and one I'm going to be suggesting for a law firm I'm working with, is retaining any kind of content you keep in a site. I'm saying a legal matter site here. It could be a project site. It could be whatever you are. If you have any kind of provisioning solution for creating sites to store some attributes, this is a great use case for it. So we don't want retention to start until that legal matter is concluded or until that project site is concluded. So SharePoint here, again, this really relies on a strong fundamentals on SharePoint search and how the search index works, because I'm going to be using two things. One is during my provisioning process, I'm setting some custom properties at the SharePoint site level. That's done in a site property bag. So, you know, this is nothing you can set through the UI. So this is where compliance teams need to work lockstep in with IT teams that know how to do this if there is a need for it. So here I'm setting the site type to legal matter site and the site status to concluded through some automation. So when the site's created, the site status would be active, likely, and then only when it's concluded and whatever is kind of driving that process, this could update the status to concluded, meaning we want to start retention. So we map these two custom site properties to refinable strings in the SharePoint search schema. So I've got refinable string 50 as the type, refinable string 51 as the status. I put that in the search query, in content search, to validate, okay, you know, I've got this set up, what am I getting back as concluded legal matter sites? So in my test that I ran, I had 5 sites in total, 2 were active, 3 were concluded, and you can see it picked up the 3 that were concluded. So these are the 3 I want included in my retention policy. So I create a new adaptive scope. This time it's a SharePoint site scope, not a user scope. So we want it based on an attribute of a site. I'm using the GUI. You can see the query summary is generated for you when you use the GUI on what kind of criteria you want. creates a scope. I validated after a day that it brought in the correct SharePoint site, so it's reading that attribute correctly on the SharePoint site. Now I'm setting up a retention label, and I want, is that true? Create a retention label and auto-apply it to the SharePoint site's content included in the scope, yes. So I auto-apply a label. This time I picked file extensions. So just another way of detecting the different content inside your site that you want to apply a retention label to. I pick adaptive, pick my adaptive scope I just created. At the bottom, I only want this applying to SharePoint sites. Even if I picked OneDrive accounts, it wouldn't have any of them anyway because they don't have that site property. I pick a label, and after a few days, up to 7, you can see legal matter test, my retention label was published. And then I just want to show the 3 on top didn't get the label because that wasn't in my condition. So you have to have that right condition defined for your particular scenario. So some other examples I've seen, the middle one, particularly in global organizations, multi-geo, they have different requirements depending on what geography you're in. So you could definitely use this as long as you're keeping track of their user location inside of Azure AD. Okay, so finally we're here. We're about an hour in. The reason those top 5 things are so important, I said it before, is they really inform what we're going to deploy and configure in our environment. Retention policies and or retention labels. And once you do that, then the principles of retention kick in and they determine basically the action to take on each item when the retention period has been reached or when the deletion time period has been reached. And this, in fact, is what guarantees compliance at the end of the day. It's the technical underpinning or the technical implementation of your requirements, your regulatory requirements coming from your compliance teams. And this is, what makes, if you get an audit, this is what will make it so you pass your audit. So they're going to be searching for things, and you want to make sure you, in fact, have deleted things that you are legally obliged to do. One thing I didn't talk about is the rule that kind of trumps all of this, even the principles of retention, is a legal hold. A legal hold is really like a retention policy set to forever while it's in effect. So, you don't even get past rule 1 on the principles of retention. It trumps absolutely everything. So that's why the layered approach of retention controls work together. So make sure your legal teams know as soon as they put a legal hold on a custodian, even if they're included in a number of other retention policies and or retention labels that delete things, all of that is paused while the legal hold is still in effect. So here's the principles of retention. 4 levels, so pretty simple. I'm just going to maybe pause for questions while I look at this. Brian, this was a while ago. A baseline policy applied to all content would not be applicable for most companies. At a minimum, it could work for some services, but not all. For example, business users often tell me they have content actively used by them while they are in their role. That could be 3 years or 37. Where do they store this content if you apply a baseline policy? Well, a retention label, they could decide, they have content that is actively used by them while they are in their role. Where do they store this content if you apply? Well, they have to apply a retention label to content they don't want deleted. Or maybe they don't store it in their OneDrive. Maybe you've only published a baseline policy to OneDrives. Maybe they have to store it in a SharePoint site. I would have to know more about the scenario or the situation. Could be role-based. You talked about they're in a certain role. Maybe using adaptive scopes, you could have a different policy set for people in a certain role, and that would negate or override the default policy that you have set up. Is that Microsoft's language, or does it always take that long? The up to 7 days, that's what you need to communicate to your compliance people. It could take less than that because you have no insight on when the batch processes that are running in the background, the services that are running, scanning all of the content, figuring out what needs to have a retention label applied. That's what you don't have insight into. So up to 7 days is always what I tell customers. Okay, so 4 rules. The first thing I want to point out is when you start at level 1 and what you're comparing is everything that's been published to that particular location, and in addition to any label that may be on a particular document. So a document can only have 1 label, but it can have multiple policies published to the same location. So if you're checking through these rules, retention wins over deletion. If there's something that is a delete only and something has a retain only, then you stop. You don't have to go to level 2. There's a winner at that level. One very misunderstood piece of this that I've heard is that a retention label will always override a retention policy. That is absolutely incorrect. That is not true. These same rules apply. It doesn't matter if it's a policy or a label. That's why you need to know the difference between those two. Retention wins over deletion. So retention label really only kicks in until level 3, explicit over implicit. So if you have the same retention settings on a policy and a label, there'd be a tie at level 1, you would go down to level 2. Longest retention period wins. Is there a difference between those two? If the policy is longer than the label, then the policy wins and you stop checking. So you really only get down to level 3 if there's a deletion component to the retention policy or label. Microsoft, I'm going to show what Microsoft has come up with. They've actually built a flow chart. They took a lot of time and effort going into building a flow chart that you can walk through your own scenarios to kind of test how long things are going to be retained for. So super helpful. I will show that in a moment. Just looking at the time, 11:40. I was going to go through these, but I'm thinking I may just, I'm going to share the slides. I would encourage you, maybe you have a handle on this, then don't bother. But if you're trying to understand how the principles of retention work, I would suggest you go through these scenarios on determining basically the life cycle for the item. At what point is it deleted? And can end users delete it early? Because in some cases they can. And then kind of what is winning in the principles of retention on those 4 rules. So I've got 4 of these pages. We'll maybe just walk through one and then I'll leave the rest. So if we had a retention policy published to a site to retain for a year and delete, a retention label applied to some documents on that site to retain for 2 years then delete. Labeled documents, if we look at example 1, would be retained for 2 years then deleted because it's a longer retention period. And unlabeled content is only the retention policy is what's in effect for unlabeled content, so it would be retained for only 1 year and then deleted. So that's where 2 things working together are going to have 2 very different retention periods associated with them. So on the labeled docs, the longest retention period wins, and on other unlabeled documents, retention wins over deletion. There's really no deletion component, so it just retains for as long as it's supposed to, and then it automatically deletes it. On the second example, the retention policy is the same. The retention label is for a shorter period than the retention policy. So in this case, it doesn't matter if the document is labeled or unlabeled because the longest retention period wins, which in this case is a retention policy. So you can see how it can get very confusing and these should probably be running through your mind when Compliance, a records manager maybe comes to you and they want to make sure everything is retained for 3 years, but they want to label these documents in addition to that. Unless those documents have a longer retention period, then they're going to be kept for as long as the retention policy anyway. So important to understand these things. So I won't dwell on them. I've got some deletion examples here, some combined, which is typically what you see. So there's a retention component and a deletion component. And what I have done, just because I wanted to test this end to end and see it with my own eyes, is I spent quite a bit of time, I would say 3 months, setting up all of these scenarios in a demo environment, and then just waiting for the retention period to be reached or the deletion period to be reached in SharePoint and Exchange, and just kind of witness and document what I had found. So what I did was I put out a challenge through my blog, and I listed the scenarios, and then it's an anonymous survey, so nobody has to see your answers. You can answer what you think, labeled and unlabeled documents or emails, how long they'll be retained or deleted, and then see what the real answer was. So please feel free to go to my blog and kind of follow those 6 different scenarios. I just wanted to show you, we've got a few minutes. I really like this flow chart right here that Microsoft put together. So it determines when an item will be retained or permanently deleted. And Microsoft did this because there was confusion in the field. So both from customers and from consultants on how this all worked. The biggest one being a retention label put on a piece of content. So you can see it's basically a decision tree. So it's quite appealing for, kind of analytical IT people to kind of walk through the path and see where things flow and end up. So I linked to this in the end of the presentation. I would encourage you to go there as well. Okay, disposition, just want to talk about this. So once the principles of retention kick in and it's ultimately determined that a piece of content needs to be deleted, if you've marked that retention label to have a disposition review, it's going to go through this process. Recently, Microsoft announced adding up to 5 stages of disposition review. So imagine you have a records management team, you have maybe the business owner team associated with that retention label, kind of a multi-stepped deletion process or disposition approval process. So you can do individual documents or in bulk, and there's a number of actions you can take. And you can export disposed items for a certificate of destruction. Current state of the certificate as the metadata that comes right out of the disposition review process, it's quite limited. So most records management teams I talk to, it's not sufficient for the regulator. So they're having to kind of massage it and do their own kind of additional information in there. So I just wanted to point that out. And another pain point for records managers is typically they like to work with disposition at, I call it case in quotation marks. It's a grouping of documents. So it could be all of the documents relating to the contract or all of the documents relating to project X. And although you can sort and filter inside the disposition review screen, it's not built at that case construct level. So just wanted to point that out as well. Although you can do bulk, so you can make sure you're selecting everything in a case and disposition it with the same action. It's the tooling isn't built to kind of pre-identify those cases for you. So you can see you can approve the disposal, you can apply a different label on it, you can say I want to keep this for an extra year, you can add a reviewer in the moment that isn't identified as a disposition reviewer if for whatever reason you wanted to have Bob the engineer to look at this schematic diagram to make sure we can in fact dispose of it, so you can do those kinds of things. So here I'm in a tenant and I've got a bunch of things up for disposition. and the count you can see on the right-hand side. So we're going to walk through corp policy demo label and show what its dispositions are like. So there's 31 in there. So you can see all of the documents listed in here. You of course need to have, as a disposition reviewer, the right role to be in here. You will see everything that that has been basically assigned to you as a disposition reviewer. So if I select a document, given the right permissions, this pane will slide out and I can see the document. This does not give me access to the SharePoint site that this lives on. It gives me an elevated level of permission to allow me to see kind of a preview of the document. Super important if I want to make a judgment call on how are we going to action the disposition on this content. Do we need to keep it? Can we delete it? Do I need to extend it? It's an informed decision the disposition reviewer is having to make. So therefore, it's very important that they can see the content in most cases. So I'm approving the disposal on this particular document. I can put in a comment. Lots of disposition review teams have records managers, have a process for, sometimes there's a disposition authority number that you're keeping track of that you want to put in here. So it is an opportunity to do that as well. And then it successfully disposes of it. Now it won't show immediately in the disposed items tab. That takes a while, and I don't even want to say how long, because I can't remember. But anyway, when you're putting together a demo, you go there and you want to show it right away, but it takes a while, but they will eventually show up there. Okay, so 1150. So that is all. I'm just summarizing those. Now, for sure, the records managers are going to have to know stuff on the right-hand side as well. It's just my kind of grouping of these concepts. They probably won't have to know it to the level that you as an IT admin, like particularly on the adaptive scope side, they will come at you with the compliance requirement, and it's up to you to kind of translate that into how are we going to build that into our either Azure AD or our site provisioning solutions. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it here, leave it open for questions, and I'm going to peruse the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute and ask directly, please feel free to do that.
Joanne, thank you very much. This is Doug again, everybody.
Hi, Doug.
I just want to also review and pick the winner for our gift card during this session today.
Oh, yes.
We do appreciate everyone participating and being involved during these presentations. Go ahead and just spin the wheel of chance.
Spin the virtual wheel.
Yes. And then the winner is Matt Linsbach. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly or close enough.
Awesome. Congratulations,
Close
Matt.
enough, thank you.
How do you pronounce it, just for me?
Linsbach is fine.
Okay.
You did great.
Perfect. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And then I do want to mention our next session again. And this grouping will be at 1 p.m. Our 12 p.m. Central session again, Central Time, is going to be in its own segment again, so it'll be on a different meeting channel. If anybody needs that link, let me know and I can just put that into chat.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I don't see any other questions. Nobody has a compliance question?